Hello and welcome to our podcast Pager. I'm George Milner.
And I'm Stan Dale.
Tune in to hear us talk with some amazing people about the subjects changing medicine today.
From stem cells to mapping the brain and medical ethics, we hope to give you a glimpse of the bright future ahead through discussions with some of the people making it happen. Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. This week's episode is with David Nott. David is a consultant vascular and general surgeon based in London, but who for the last 25 years has taken unpaid leave to work as a humanitarian surgeon in disaster and conflict zones all around the world. He's also the author of the best-selling book War Doctor, which was published last year, and in which he gives an account of his life's work, as well as his motivations and the effects it's had on his life outside. I think David has been on roughly the order of 30 missions, which has included travelling to Sarajevo during the Bosnian War, as well as several missions to Syria during the recent civil war. In the episode, we discuss everything from the challenging nature of teamwork and decision-making as medical staff in what David has coined austere environments, through to the ethical conundrum posed by treating ISIS fighters in Syria. We also discuss the broad skill base needed for humanitarian work, which goes against the grain of increasing medical specialisation in countries like the UK. Finally, towards the end, David recounts his involvement in the political negotiations to free his trapped colleagues in Aleppo as the Syrian regime closed in on the city in 2016. We really enjoyed recording the episode with David, and we hope you enjoyed as well. So without further ado, I bring you David Nott. David, I know it's sort of late in the day, and you're on call, you just told me, but thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
It's a real pleasure, Stan.
I sort of wanted to start by talking about what this idea of an austere environment is, and what makes an environment difficult to do surgery or give medical care in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I called it an austere environment because it's not like where we're working in UK or Europe or the first world, where you really have everything. You have your operating theatre and you have your patients, you have multidisciplinary team meetings, you have as much investigatory tools as you have CT scans, MRIs and ultrasound scans and all sorts of high-tech equipment. And when you operate on patients, you have everything at hand. And if you want this and that and the other thing, it's there for you. And you have the best instruments, you have the best needles, you have the best everything really, and rightly so really. Every human being has a right to have the best in life, and I think that's what we do here. We give people the very, very best that's possible to give on a medical surgical front. But the majority of the world, I would say about 85 to 90% of the world don't have this. And they live in very difficult environments. They live in areas which is, there are no doctors there. There are very few doctors. And if they are there's one doctor per million people, or 2 million, 3 million people. And not only that, some of the situations that I go to, especially for war, are in dreadful, dreadful situations whereby people are psychologically traumatized. There's a war going on around them. The civilians are, most of the people I deal with are civilians. And the operating theatres you deal in don't have any investigatory tools at all. And you find the same sort of injuries as you would do in a car accident in the UK, as you have a car accident and worse things, blast injuries and so on, in where you're actually working. And then you haven't got blood, you haven't got the resources, you haven't got intensive care, you haven't got the right equipment, you haven't got the tools to do the right job. And so therefore, that's the sort of environment that I found myself working in over 25 years. And you have to adapt very carefully. You have to adapt what's right for the patient. And, sometimes here in the UK that you would, really open the floodgates and you would try everything you possibly can. There, those people don't have that luxury, and you have to make very difficult decisions. And it's like this is. You have to make decisions on who lives and who dies based on what equipment and resources that you have. And not only that, your life also is, when you go to these places, you're taking a huge risk, and your life too in the operating theatre. The hospital could be bombed, which it shouldn't be, but it sometimes is, and that's what I'm talking about when I say the austere environment.
Well, in a remarkably pithy way, I have to say you've essentially cut through every single component of what I wanted to ask you about, working in the most austere environments. Of course, you spoke about how you worked in several different parts of the world, Sarajevo, Syria, Africa. I'm assuming the difficulties you found sort of vary between the missions. So sometimes was it medical, like sort of medicine shortages, which were the hardest, other times perhaps lack of imaging, and sort of, what makes each environment. I suppose what I'm wondering is, what are the specific challenges that come with each of those?
Well, there are physical challenges, really. There are physical challenges in getting to the actual place itself, really. There are dangers getting to the place. If you go into Yemen, for example, I was working in the north in Yemen, a place called Raze, which was under attack from the south a few years ago. And to get to Raze in the north, which is just below Saudi, it was a real adventure. And you go through checkpoints after checkpoints, and there's a risk of being kidnapped, and you have to sign forms that allow you to, your next of kin will know that it's you that's been kidnapped, because they're only, the color of your car and what make it is, and so on.
So do you travel with your own identity? I don't even know what to make of that. I mean, how do you manage the risk of being kidnapped?
Well, it is a risk. It's a risk. It's a real risk, and in Afghanistan several years ago, there was a group of doctors working for Médecins Sans Frontières who were stopped at a checkpoint and all killed. And I think it's about 20 years ago or something now. And that's when I was working for MSF at the time. And you hear about that, you really do have to take risks going to places. And then there's not only that, it's the physical risk as well to yourself. It's the conditions that you're actually in. In Africa, for example, in Chad, the temperature went up to 48, 50 degrees centigrade at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And it is absolutely impossible to work in those environments. But the trouble is, you've got to go and do your cesarean section at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, because there's nobody else to do, and they've got an obstructed labour to deal with, and you've got these people piling up, and you are really stressed. You're not just stressed because of what you've got, the surgery you've got to do with no blood or anything like that. You're stressed because you're hot and physically feel ill and dehydrated with a headache and things.
I've got to say, you're making me feel quite guilty about complaining about the current heat wave in the UK. And I remember in the book you spoke about that mission in Chad in particular. You got dangerously dehydrated on that mission, if I remember correctly.
Very much so, yeah.
And am I right in thinking you almost started to hallucinate? And
yeah, I was suffering from hyperthermia. The people that on when you work and when you have to run to places, because we were quite away from the hospital, and sometimes the car didn't work, and they got you got a call to say that there's somebody being shot or somebody's bleeding to death or something. So you run down to the hospital, you run in this temperature, and by the time you get there, you are hyperthermic, and you hear about soldiers dying when they're on. Walking around Brecon and things like that, and their temperature goes up. And I had exactly the same. And all of a sudden, I had this terrible headache, and then felt ill and felt sick and almost died, actually. And if it wasn't for the anaesthetist, putting up drips and covering me with, it sounds strange to say at the time, but you get covered in blankets because your temperature actually goes down if you're in 50 degrees centigrade, and you put cold blankets on somebody and you build a sort of like an igloo around them. So the things like that, and you can protect people from hypothermia by doing bizarre things. And I almost died from that. And I remember hallucinating, seeing tractors in my bedroom and all sorts of stuff. And it took about 3 or 4 days to get over it. But in hyperthermia, all your organs start to fail. And I can remember as well that I was catheterized and so on with the nurse there. And there was only there was only an anaesthetist, a nurse, and myself in this hospital. And the surgeon then was out because he had hyperthermia. And if it wasn't for the anaesthetist really pouring fluids into me, I would have died because my kidneys would have packed up. And it was such a long journey to get there. It took by road 2 days to get there, and we would never have been able to get out. And so there are things like these. These are the things that you have to put up.
I mean, it's a testament to sort of how high stakes the environments you were working in. That is not the only time described throughout the book where you had a near-death experience. I'm just wondering, was sort of the thought process that you experienced during that different to the other times where you were perhaps more in your right mind, so to speak? Did you have any sort of awareness that you might be close to death?
No, not at all. I mean, all I remember is coming out of it and having the worst hallucinogenic dreams ever. Seeing elephants in the room, seeing people coming towards me, seeing things coming out of the walls.
Water, I hope.
Well, unfortunately not, but I remember this sort of tractor wheel going through mud next to me, and it was the most terrifying thing. And I think from listening to the anaesthetist and the nurse, I was screaming and yelling and all sorts of stuff. I didn't know anything about it, and I think that's what happens to you. Your brain just starts to melt, and you don't know what's going on. But those are the times whereby life is funny. Really, it makes you really understand what life is about, and you really do walk on very thin ice sometimes, and you can always fall through if you're not careful. But in the austere world, everybody realizes that they are going to die. You know that if you're in Afghanistan, that you'll be dead by the time you're 45 as a man, and so people realize that life expectancies are very short, and it's a completely different ball game in the first world where you're still treating 104-year-old people.
Having lived amongst people who are in these environments, I'm sure that lends you some perspective into their perspective and how perhaps they're thinking about risk and decision-making change as a consequence of the world that they're in being entirely alien to the one that we're in.
Well, you have to go when you do go and work in these environments. You really do have to put a different head on your shoulders. I mean, you cannot go with the first world head, because you will try and save every single person that's there, and you'll use all your requirements, your resources in the first patient that you'll actually deal with. So you really do have to put a different head on, and you have to be, people do accept that the doctor there is trying to save that person's life. But if he doesn't save the life, then it's not anybody's fault. It just happens. Whereas here, everything it's a different ball game altogether, and you just have to appreciate that. And then when you come back, again, you have to realize that you're now back in the first world, and you have to change your attitude to life and death and so on. So it's a really interesting psychology, really, of the brain when you go and work in very difficult environments and then come back. It's like the same thing. If you may have a kilo of rice or something which will last you for a week or something like that, and that's all you'll have. And then you come back to the UK and you land at Heathrow and you walk into Heathrow Airport, and it's like golden pavements with things dripping off the walls.
I think that's certainly one of the most fascinating parts of the book, and I definitely want to return to some of the more emotional components of kind of your experience. But just quickly going back to talking about managing patients in these environments and the decision making that goes along with that. You speak a bit about having to learn. I can never pronounce the word. You might have to bail me out. There we go. That's the one. Learning a lot of those skills kind of early in your career when you were going away, even though you're a vascular surgeon.
Yeah. Can I just say, I am a specialty vascular surgeon. One of my specialties is vascular surgery. Another one is general surgery, and I also do cancer. That's very unusual working in the NHS, as you rightly just said, that one is named as a vascular surgeon, but vascular surgery is a very small percentage of the things that you do when you go to a different environment. And so the big problem is that people are very specialized these days, and going to an austere environment. The first thing I remember going to Nepal, to the earthquake in Nepal, and arriving on a journey from Kathmandu to Aragat Bazaar, which was 7-hour journey in a car, which normally took 40 minutes, which took 7 hours, because the earthquake had caused landslides. It had caused really big problems with. It was raining as well, and there was potential for the car to come off the road, and then you suddenly arrive in this place called Aragat Bazaar, which was the center of the earthquake, really, in Nepal at that time. And suddenly somebody will, as you're absolutely destroyed, tired, worn out, and
your reward for arriving is delivering a baby or something on that order.
Exactly. And a woman will, the midwife runs up to you and says, "David, you're the new surgeon?" I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Oh, thank goodness, because there's a foot hanging out of a vagina. So that means that the baby's in a breech delivery, and you need to be able to use every single skill you have as a surgeon to help that pregnant woman and try and deliver her a normal baby." So there are very, very difficult things to cope with. So very early on, I really realized that there's 10 times, 100 billion times more that I need to know about. And if I don't know them, then people are going to suffer. And I can't just arrive in the hospital as the surgeon and not be able to do every single operation that I could potentially do. So I learned on the hoof, so to speak, really. It's very funny that when you do meet people, certainly when you're working for the International Committee of the Red Cross, they do have surgeon mentors, and they do have senior surgeons and junior surgeons, and even the senior surgeon may be much younger than you are, but he's got a lot more experience in working in this sort of environment when you first start. So you just learn from him.
I imagine the most useful skill is being able to pick up new skills as quickly as possible.
Oh, yeah.
A follow-up question to that, which I wanted to ask, is has there been good epidemiological data gathered on how to sort of manage surgical cases in war zones?
No.
Because I imagine that's really, okay, I was going to say, I imagine that's an environment where it's very difficult to report that sort of properly.
Well, that's a really, really good question. But the bottom line of it is no. And the reason why it's no, the documentation is so bad. And, going back to, say, Central African Republic or something, you've got 7 doctors to look after a whole of that country. 7 doctors.
I mean, let's just put that into perspective. That's fewer than you'd find in some clinics in London. That's unbelievable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so how are you going to collect epidemiological data on what patients have and everything else? I mean, epidemiology is there so that you can look what's happening on the ground, and then you can potentially change it if things are not going in the right direction. But it's impossible to do anything like that in, say, Central African Republic. You'll just treat one patient as they come to your best of your abilities. And so epidemiological data is very scarce and rare. And of course, in war zones as well, there's no documentation. You very rarely write anything down. You're just treating that patient. It's all word of mouth of one person telling the next person, and that patient can't stay in the hospital that long because they've got crowds of people coming in. So you've got to get them out, and so there is very few. And we were discussing this in Imperial the other day, really. All the blast wounds, gunshot wounds, and everything else around the world. Unfortunately, nobody has any data relating to how many injuries, what happened to them, did anything surgical change to make that patient any better. We do not have any of that data.
I mean, it sounds like the problem cuts deeper than collecting what you might consider epidemiological data for studies. Really, just the continuity of care isn't there in the first place. So I imagine once you send patients out of their emergency care, that might essentially be the last you hear of them until they crop up somewhere else
Yeah,
with potential complications.
absolutely. Absolutely. And you don't know where they're going to either. You don't know what sort of state of home they're going to. Maybe it's been blown up. But that patient, doesn't have the understanding that they have hospital notes. And so they'll leave them somewhere. So everything is, start again, so to speak, when somebody walks into your clinic. You have to work out exactly, well, what's wrong with you, and ask you some questions and so on. But yes, so your answer to your question is no.
And I think that leads us really well on to talking about something which you discuss in the book, which is arguments within people, within the teams who are providing care, and how teamwork and cooperation works in these incredibly stressful environments. And the reason that led me on to thinking about that is that without good data on what works and what doesn't, when you're using different tools and different resources to what everyone's used to, there's very little opportunity to prove yourself right in the decision making you do, I imagine. And I imagine that makes sort of arguments all the harder to resolve, because after the fact, no one necessarily knows who was right and who was wrong.
Yeah, no, again, you asked some very good questions, Stan. It's true. I mean, what it boils down to is experience. It's experience of the person. But again, that experience may not be as good as somebody else's experience, and his background knowledge may not be as good as somebody else's. So, I have had major run-ins with people on missions, especially missions where it's not war, but it's catastrophe, various earthquakes and things like that, where the only thing that will happen to you is a bit of a rumble in the ground, but you've still got lots of patients to treat. I mean, I had the honour, as I would probably say, really a very late stage in life, really, of wanting to go and see what it was like to work in the military. So I joined up just to go to Iraq to see what it was like to work in a team in Basra. And that team was so well trained. Everybody was trained to the same level. So the knowledge that people had and the team working was unbelievable. And exactly the same happened when I went to Camp Bastion in 2010, again as the senior surgeon for the hospital. The team working there was fantastic because everybody knew what role they were doing. It was just it worked like clockwork, and that's why Camp Bastion had the highest, best results really in trauma in the whole world, and still will hold that. 97% of people that came into Camp Bastion lived, which is very unusual.
I'd like to dig a bit deeper into this difference between your experience in conflict zones and in disaster zones. It seems like beyond the sort of technical excellence that there is in the army, part of what made the job in one sense easier in a conflict is that maybe the personal danger really engendered sort of closer bonding quickly. Whereas in a disaster, you've got all the difficulties of the job. It's a tough environment, but there isn't that.
Yes, no, that you put your finger on it really. But again, I mean, I only did 2 missions with the military. 25 missions have been with other organisations, and again, that also is difficult because you're working with people that you haven't met before. It's a dangerous environment, but you've got to stay very diplomatic in these environments because you're in their country, you are somebody that's come in to help, but you're a stranger in their country, and they don't know you, you don't know them, and you've walked into their land, and it could be such that you're 50, 60, 70 miles into a territory which you'd have very great difficulty in leaving. So you've got to look after yourself as well at the same time. So
I think that's incredibly interesting. I mean, you mentioned in the book your mission in 2014 to Syria, and at that time, ISIS were essentially on the hunt for Westerners to capture. And I think part of what you're saying is that not only are you in somebody else's country, but you are, by virtue of being in someone else's country, dependent on them and dependent on them to protect you, even if that protection is just in the form of not turning you over. And I suppose, like you said, the difficulty that brings is when you might disagree with somebody else's decision making about the best way to treat a patient. I suppose it's a very difficult thing to really come up with any hard and fast rules about when one ought to be more assertive with what one thinks is the right thing to do, and when you ought to sort of bend a bit more, so to speak. Does that just come with experience? Were there any times? Can you think of any anecdotes where you were sure you got it right, or perhaps regret not doing something?
It does come with experience. I mean, I think it's very easy. You can't, you can't shout at anybody. You can't be the big boss man, and you can't behave in a way that you might behave when you're the leader of a team in the UK. People don't know who you are. People have no respect for you. You have to earn your respect very big time. And the only way that you earn your respect is to prove yourself to people that you can do the job. And, it comes with years and years. It takes a long time to develop the experience of being able not just to manage the patient at the best of your abilities, but to manage the team around you at the best of your abilities. And that is a very difficult thing to be able to do because, going back to Aleppo 2014, I was the only Westerner, the only free Westerner in Syria at that time, because every other Westerner was captured by ISIS and every other Westerner was having things done to him. And, it suddenly dawned on me sort of like mid-October or the first or second week into October, and I'd been there for about 6 weeks by this time, that, the time was beginning to run out, that I could make one false move and suddenly there'd be a knock on the door and suddenly I'd be taken away and I'd be put in an orange suit and that would be it. And so I actually started to panic a bit, really. Things weren't as enjoyable as they'd always been because I realized that I had really probably bitten too much off this time. And although that, you're still operating, you're still helping people, you're still trying your very, very best to try and teach the surgeons and be friendly with them and everything else, things can happen. And I remember being in one hospital and suddenly some urologist who I had met a couple of times before came up to me and said, he said, "Dr. David, I think you'd be much better coming with me to Raqqa." And
Which, of
I
course,
said,
was currently
and that was the
held by
time where,
ISIS.
yeah,
Sorry, was it the time?
absolutely. And they wanted me to be their surgeon, and they wanted me to be their surgeon in Raqqa. And
I think
I
there's
said, no,
we can doubt the sort of the validity of their claim that they wanted you for your surgical expertise.
Well, exactly. I think they just wanted to take me away. And of course, if it wasn't for Ammar, who was my surgical colleague from the UK, who's Syrian, and came into the situation to try and protect me from this chap, I don't know what would have happened, because it only takes a telephone call, or it would take something like that to realise that you're in, you could be in deep trouble. And then I started to feel that I am in deep trouble.
And go back to what Ammar said to you, because I think you described this in the book.
Yeah.
I think one of the really interesting things was it wasn't that he weighed in to defend you from this obnoxious urologist who might have had bad intentions. It was that he actually helped you restrain your worst instincts about mouthing off or saying something back, which goes back to what you were saying earlier. The two really key ingredients to do this kind of work seem to be competence and humility, fundamentally.
Yes, no, that's absolutely right, and you're right. I had seen the most awful videos of what was happening to various people, and I had sat there over breakfast with people showing me on their mobile phones, things that anybody in the world now has not seen, because I'm sure people have in the secret services and so on, but simply because it is too bad to show anybody what really, really happened. And over breakfast, sitting there saying, "Look at this, Dr. David." And of course, you look at it and you think, well, how do I look at this? Do I look away? Everybody's looking at it. Do I suddenly put my head on the ground? What do I do? So you physically
in the context of where you are right now, or do you try and detach it entirely?
Exactly. No, you have to. You can't actually start to detach yourself. You have to look at it in the context of what is going on around you, but you can't not look at it because they'd think, "Why aren't you looking at it, Dr. David?" And you have to watch these things, and then you become physically sick inside, and then you think, "I've physically got to get out of here, otherwise I'm going to be the next person that this happens to."
You come to that point in the book where you recognize that you are just in such overwhelming danger that you are running out of time. But that's in contrast to how you start the book. You talk about your motivations. One of the big motivations is the thrill of being somewhere where there is a bit of danger. And it's something I'd like to touch on again later, sort of if you plotted it as a function, how does the excitement change as the danger increases? But before we get to that, there was one more thing I wanted to ask, and you touched on it earlier, actually, with respect to decision making. And it's one of those things which is sort of very difficult to really comprehend, particularly for someone who's never been in this situation. But I think when it comes to triage, there is a category of patients who present who are described as leave to die in peace and with dignity. And to me, as somewhat of an outsider, that sounds like perhaps the hardest decision to have to make in medicine. And so what I'm wondering is, can ordinary medical intuition about throwing all the resources you have into a patient in the hopes that it will, and it likely will, increase their chance of survival by at least some fraction, can that be unhelpful when you have, like you described, limited blood available, limited operating theatres available?
Well, there are many operations that you can do for the same injury, so to speak, really, or the same problem that somebody has. You either do the operation in which you throw everything at them and they will potentially, hopefully, survive, and there's the operations whereby you throw everything at them and they die. Majority of those sort of patients with massive injury severity scores, they do die, but there are some that will make it, depending on your age, depending on your morbidity, depending on all those sort of factors. Whereas in austere environments, war zones, and so on, you're dealing with very young, not very old people a lot of the time, and you're dealing with children. You're dealing with children that are badly blown up and things like that, and suffering really badly, and also adolescents and so on. But the same rules really should apply to them, but they don't, because we don't have those sort of resources. And so you have to then make very difficult decisions on knowing, and again relates to experience. You just know, as time goes on and you become a doctor, and you become a doctor for several years, and you're immersed in this environment, you will know who will survive and who won't survive. And it becomes innate after a while. You don't have to look at any injury scores and anything like that. You'll just know that if this person comes in with a bit of renal failure or is not well for other reasons, respiratory problems and so on, and they've got a massive fracture here and they've got a big pelvic injury and they've lost a lot of blood, you know that patient's probably going to die. And most of those sort of cases in the UK, for example, you go to an intensive care unit, you're on the intensive care unit for, God knows, 4 to 6 weeks, and then you get this intensive care problem with myopathy and intensive care myopathy, and it takes another 6 months to get you up and about because you've lost all your muscles and so on and so forth. You know that patient in reality will never make it. And those are the patients that in war zones that will never make it.
But it leads us on quite well to talking about sort of medical ethics in the sort of situations you describe in the book, being in conflict zones and disaster zones. And medical ethics can sort of is notoriously blurry at the best of times. It's not a precise science, but you're describing situations where these principles that sort of the medical community, I suppose, hold dear are really pushed to their limits. And the one that I have in mind in particular is this obligation that doctors have to treat anyone who comes sort of before them for care to the best of their ability and equally. And in the book, you discuss, treating combatants in war zones. I suppose this must just be an uncomfortable standard to keep if you're treating people in a war zone. And you might have quite good reason to suspect that if you return them to health, they could go on to commit atrocities like in Syria with ISIS, for example?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was in Pakistan, northern Pakistan, working for the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I was the senior surgeon there at the time in Peshawar, and over the border in Afghanistan, which is the Khyber Pass, just between is at the bottom of almost Peshawar, and then you go up the Khyber Pass, and then on one side is Pakistan, and the other side is Afghanistan. And of course, lots of people were making bombs in Peshawar and going up the Khyber Pass and making, IEDs to blow up British people or soldiers or Americans and whatever. And then you're working for this organisation, purely humanitarian, apolitical, a-religious, blah 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 organisation, whereby you have the patient that comes in front of you is somebody that's just been blown up because he's been making that bomb and he's blown his hand off. And so, you are duty bound, as a surgeon you have to really think, wow, I'm going to make this man better, try and put his hand back together again so he can make more bombs to blow up more, British people or American people. Is that really the ethical thing to do? And I think that's your question, isn't it?
Exactly.
And it is a very difficult dilemma because ethically, as a doctor, what is your job? I mean, it should be just black and white, and that's how it has to be. You have to be black and white. You have to forget about who you're treating. You have to treat the human being in front of you and to the best of your abilities, no matter what that person is. He could be a murderer, he could be anything else, but you have to treat that person in front of you. There is no two ways about it. Even if he's done the worst things on this planet, you still have to treat them because you're a humanitarian. You are a human being treating another human being, and their clothes have been removed, their religions have been removed, everything has been removed, and on that operating table you just have a naked human being who is like you, another human being. And so that is how you got to rationalize it. And ethics, the ethical dilemma doesn't really come into it at that moment of time. You may think about it at a later date, but at the moment it doesn't come into it.
That's interesting that you're able to sort of quiet that conversation whilst the work needs to be done. Now, the foundation, the David Nott Foundation, it seems to have a very technical focus. Do you think there is a need, not necessarily from the David Nott Foundation, but in general, for doctors who are going to do humanitarian work to have some sort of preparation for what it will be like emotionally?
You're right. It is fairly technical, and the reason why I set up, or Ellie and I, my wife, set up the foundation with me, or it actually was her idea to set it up, to be honest, was certainly to pass the skills on to many surgeons that want to do humanitarian work. And the skills that I've developed over 25 years, I wanted to, the obstetrics, the pediatrics, and all this orthopedics and everything else that you have to know about before going out to a war zone or to a catastrophe area. If you've got the skills and you've been taught them by somebody that has been there, that has experience, then that, I don't think you can take that away from somebody that comes on our courses. But what we try and do as well with the foundation is not just to give courses, but to develop a sort of family, really. And we have surgeons from 60 countries, which we have got over to our courses in the UK. And not only that, we've taken courses to the front line and we've taught surgeons there. But it's not just the technical aspects; it's the camaraderie and it's the understanding and it's the psychology of actually going to some place, northern Yemen in January, unfortunately before the coronavirus started. But to be there and to actually go and see the surgeons and talk to them and understand them and immerse yourself with them for a whole week. And sometimes we're in the Yemen a year before that for 3 weeks. And you become very strong friends. And not only that, with the nurses and everybody else. So it's also the psychology. And you can't, just by teaching somebody over the internet or doing a Zoom thing. You don't know that person at all. That you see a face, and sometimes the face goes away because they cut the audio out, or you cut the video out. So you just look at a black screen. You don't know who that person is, and so you're teaching people. You can teach them, but so the most important thing to do is what the foundation does is not just the technical side, but it's also the psychology of meeting people, greeting people, putting their arm around you, putting your arm around them, saying that we're here to help you, and I'm here to help you, and we have Zoom meetings I think you were on one which didn't work beautifully well the last time.
Because we were lucky enough to be sent the links to some of the previous webinars.
Oh, were you? So you could see some of the cases that they were discussing, and that's what's fantastic. They trust us to deliver to them, and they can open up to us about their cases, and we can have long discussions about the right way to do it, and was that the right way to do it, and developing friends from 60 countries makes the foundation a sort of like a family. It's not a platform, it's a family.
We're talking about these courses, STAE courses, which are teaching doctors and surgeons in the developing world how to operate in austere environments, just for that bit of context. And I thought what was really interesting is it sounds like there's a commonality between the mentorship, which you really enjoyed, you described, I think particularly with one surgeon in Syria, Abu Wasim, and that relationship, and the foundation being almost an extension of that, and being able to provide that sort of mentorship for just a wider circle of people.
Well, you hit it on the head there, Stan, because Abu Wasim, I met first in 2013, and he was the plastic surgeon who I really brought up from being somebody who could do one operation to somebody who could do 100 operations, and in 2014 again a different person. But Abu Wasim and myself had this very, you meet people along the line and you become brothers, don't you? You have a friend, and Abu Wasim was like that. He was like a brother. He became this brother over a very short period of time. And in 2016, I can remember fighting for him to survive when he was in this small group of doctors in Aleppo that were being heavily bombed, and got to the stage where there was 100,000 people and there were 30 doctors, and they were my doctors, and it was Abu Wasim that was there, and I was determined that he wasn't going to die. And that's why I went, and at the end of the book you can see how I struggled for him, and I struggled and struggled to save his life. And I'm really pleased that I did. I mean, Abu Wasim got married last year, and he's still in Idlib. And I saw him about a year ago because we went and did a course there. And it's this sort of friendship which would never have happened had I not been a surgeon, and had I not gone out there, had I not, met that person and his friends as well. I would never have, I would never have made that relationship with another surgeon who I really wanted to protect, because why should he get killed when he has all this knowledge to help people in the future?
I've got to say that last chapter is really the most incredible read. I mean, to give people a bit of context, it's titled Escape from Aleppo, and it's set as the government forces are essentially closing in on, I believe it's the east of the city, which is sort of containing the last rebel strongholds, although that could be
Yes, correct.
It's the east. And it just details this heartbreaking sequence of events as the government forces get closer. It starts being artillery close artillery rather than barrel bombs, which are dropping all around them. And you're getting these daily WhatsApp messages from people you know and care about, imploring you to try and help in some way. I think it's an amazing chapter as well, because it's such a different perspective on the importance of the work and perhaps the role of the humanitarian doctor from the previous ones, where it's about you in situ in these environments. Could you go into more detail about the backstory of that chapter? Because I forgot to mention, you then proceed to do everything you can to help open a road to get people out of Aleppo and organize a ceasefire, which involves emails to the US State Department, calling up the President Bashar Assad's office, potentially speaking with Putin. It's just the most surreal and amazing thing to read. I can't help myself but ask, do you have any sort of juicy details you can share about the backstory?
I mean, that it was a most surreal moment of my life, really. I was determined that, every day, as you rightly say, I was getting WhatsApp messages. David, Dave, you've got to help us. You really, because we're all going to die. You really have to help us. And of course, I couldn't, if somebody says that to you, as a human being, you've just got to go and help. But in one respect, I just went totally over the top. And I was determined that I wasn't going to let Abu Wasim and his friends die. I was absolutely determined. And it got to the stage whereby I was at the Foreign Office most days. I was talking to various people in the Foreign Office. I was at the Russian embassy once a week, talking to the consul, talking to the ambassador, talking to everybody, talking to get me to see President Putin. And then I needed to talk to President Assad. And I needed to tell him to stop bombing my friends. And that sounds ridiculous. But the most amazing thing happened to me very early on in my career when I was at St. Mary's. I met President Assad when he was an SHO in ophthalmology at the Western Eye Hospital. And my father, who was an orthopedic surgeon, had many Syrian colleagues, registrars, who also knew and knew him too, and blah, blah. So there was this link that I had with him, and I can't tell you how, unfortunately, I got but I'll tell you a little bit, okay? My phone went off, and it was somebody that said to me that, would you like to meet me? I've got some information for you. And anyway, it then came to pass that they had the telephone numbers of President Assad's office and a direct line to President Assad, and they had an interpreter, and they could get me into the office, and you could speak to him and tell him that you were a surgeon who worked with him, you knew his friends, all the friends that I had. And so in the end, bottom line of it was that I spoke to President Assad. I pleaded for the lives of other doctors, saying that he had going back to medical ethics, that he'd signed the documents that we all signed to become a doctor. I signed it, you signed it, and therefore we have to work together. And this went on, and every morning at 6:00, every morning I would make that telephone call. And then finally, there was this very gruff people getting through to try and get to him. And finally I spoke to him, and then he thanked me very much for calling. And then 3 days later, there was a ceasefire, and they were all out. And so it all happened, and the jigsaw pieces all worked together. And finally, the person that really made the call was the foreign minister for Turkey. He made a big plea, and that was through me speaking to him and forcing the issue with Assad. And then it all. And that was that.
It's remarkable. You were pulling all the threads you could without necessarily knowing which ones might make the difference. But
no, and you've got to kick every door. In times like this, you have to kick every single door, and one of them will eventually open.
There are two final threads I want to pull on that, and then I think that's probably all the questions. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. But the first thing I wanted to pull on was, I wonder if so the things you're teaching through the foundation, are some of them more old-fashioned surgical techniques? Are they things that sort of older surgeons might be more familiar with? I'm just wondering if it's almost like...
Yes, indeed. I mean, for example, the orthopedics in the UK, it's all plates and screws and nails and things like that. But all the mod-con things, we haven't got there. And you go back to the basics of, traction and external fixation. But in external fixation, people have to realize that the bones have to be together. You can't have a bit of, muscle in between. So that's what we're teaching. It's the fundamentals of, unfortunately, somebody with a femur fracture will be on traction for 3 months in an austere environment. And that whereas in the UK, if you get a femur fracture, you have a nail put down your femur and reamed and a nail put down, and you're up and walking within 24 hours. So it's a different ball game altogether. But the same injuries, but treated differently with the old kit that used to be done 30, 40 years ago, because we haven't got the new kit. Because if you put the new kit in somebody at the moment, they would get osteomyelitis because their sterility is so poor. So you have to go back to basic things which can be used in any environment, which will give the best result. And it sometimes takes much longer.
Reading the book, it seemed like, actually talking about doctors in the UK doing humanitarian work, there are strong financial incentives not to do humanitarian work. When you would go on missions, you'd have to ask for unpaid leave, and you even write about paying an Australian colleague to do some of the work, your work that needed to be done. I think it was locum work, so that you could go. I wonder, is there a better way that we can make it less financially punishing for people to do this kind of work?
Well, Médecins Sans Frontières, Paris section have it's in their clause really, and the government have written it in that when they do go on a mission, the government will pay for that doctor to go on his mission, so they'll pay his mortgage, they'll give him his financial support, and so the French have sorted it out. But try and get the British to sort it out is another thing, and I have, again, tried and tried and tried. At the moment, we've got this thing that the chief executives from a hospital can let you go on a mission at short notice, but the financial rewards still are being discussed, and it's been discussed now for 15 years. So, where do I go? Where do we go from here? I think we're still in that situation whereby it just needs somebody to keep bashing down that door with a big hammer, to allow people to get paid to go off and do humanitarian work. And so I think the only way to do it really is, unfortunately at the moment, is still to take unpaid leave. And I've managed to get the NGOs to reduce the amount of time that you can spend there. And MSF can take you now for 3 weeks if you're a surgeon, but you have to be a consultant surgeon. And then if you're a consultant surgeon, then you have a family and you've got to pay your mortgage, and who's going to pay that? So it is very, very difficult, but it's another door that perhaps your generation need to kick in.
One more door to kick down in the future. I'm aware that I'm sort of eating up your time, and it's now 10:40, so perhaps this would be a good point to wrap it up. Let me just first say thank you so much for coming on and sharing your sort of story about your life's work. It's sort of both incredibly humbling and I think quite beautiful. I definitely recommend anyone who hasn't read the book War Doctor to go out and get it. So thank you again.
Thanks, Dan. It's been a pleasure, and all the very best to you in your future.
Thank you for listening to the Pager podcast. If you've enjoyed it, then head to Spotify or iTunes to hear more.
As ever, we'd love to hear what you think, and you can reach us via our Facebook page or by email. See you next time.